Okay, if we're all ready, we'll go ahead and open tonight's meeting. This is the October 6th, 2022 Bellingham Planning Commission meeting. Tonight's agenda, we have a presentation from city staff on urban village design review updates. Planning Commission has a packed up October schedule. We will be talking about this topic again in 2 weeks with a public hearing on design review, which is the public's opportunity to give us feedback on design review. And then we have another meeting on a bonus third meeting, October 27th, picking back up and continuing on ADU, accessory dwelling units. So before we kick off that agenda, or actually, why don't we, Heather, can you please call the roll?
Mike Estes.
Here.
Jed Ballou.
Here.
Rose Lathrop. Rose is here. Mike McCauley.
Here.
Barbara Plaskett.
Here.
Scott Jones.
Here.
And Russ Whidbey might be joining us a little bit late. I don't see him quite yet.
Okay. At the beginning of every meeting, we like to take general public comment on any planning topic, issues of concern. So I'd like to take this chance to open the floor for any members of the public who'd like to speak to the commission. Just go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom if you would like to. I see we have one attendee tonight. Okay. Not seeing any hands, so we'll go ahead and just close the general public comment. And I will turn the meeting over to Chris Behe and the rest of city staff.
Great, thanks, Mike. Chris Behe, your long-range planning manager, and I'm just going to very quickly hand off to Darby Galligan, who's one of our senior planners, and she's the project manager for this code update. And she'll be presenting tonight, and I'll let Darby introduce her team. So take it away, Darby.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and good evening, planning commissioners. It's been a while since I've had the pleasure of joining this commission, and there's some new faces. So it's great to be here, and I look forward to working with you on this project. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Emmy Scherer in the planning department. She's going to help talk a little bit about the historic guidelines that we've been working on. And then we also have Grace Kim joining us from Seattle from Schemata Workshop. Grace and her colleague Joanne Ware have been instrumental guides in helping us navigate a pretty complicated and long process. So I'm just going to dive in. I think our purpose tonight is really to give you an overview of the project. Explain a little bit about the structure. I'm sure when you got that gigantic packet, you were, just dove right into the hundreds of pages, but we'd like to provide a little bit of context to help orient you to the project so that we can set up an agenda and kind of get a better handle on what your main interests and questions are so that we can be efficient at our next meeting. So I'll start with just a little background on the project structure, and then I'll turn it over to Grace to talk a little bit about the process of developing the guidelines and kind of how the guidelines work, how we are hoping they get used by our applicants. And then we'll talk about the codes and standards, which are the shoulds, and then the process changes, and then kind of wrap it up from there. So try to keep the presentation portion quick. Here are some of the project goals for the project, which were also outlined in the staff report. But really what I want to focus on is that this is an economic development effort. What we've heard over the years is that design review can be very confusing for applicants. It can be very cumbersome. It's been hard to identify what is a should and what is a shall. What would we like you to do versus what is absolutely required? What's the hierarchy of the guidelines and standards, and where to just find things in our big mess of code? I know some of you have dove pretty deep into some of our Bellingham Municipal Code, and we're doing some amazing work to try to clean it up. And this is one of those efforts to try to make it a little bit better organized and intuitive to use. So I've talked a couple times, and it took us a while as this project started going to get really, really clear about these 3 buckets. And really overall, a lot of this project was a reorganization and a sorting and looking at where things were almost the same and how can we make them the same and then put them into these different buckets. So over on the right-hand side, we had a lot of different standalone design standards and design guidelines that applied to different villages. And we went through all of them in depth and started sorting. Okay, which of these things should apply to all the urban villages, which are the urban village guidelines? Are there some that really are just applicable to this single district? Okay, that can go in the appendix to that guideline. It's kind of a special snowflake item. And same for the standards. Which are the ones that should just be universally applied and which are the ones that should be in that particular urban village code? So spent a lot of time going through them and also starting to sort through, are there certain guidelines or requirements that we're consistently giving departures to? If that's the case, then maybe we shouldn't have them in there as a requirement. So we spent a lot of time interviewing applicants, planners, other board and commission staff, and kind of working through, what are the priorities here and what do we really want to focus on in our urban village development? The other thing that I think is pretty important is that we're trying to differentiate between the roles of the different bodies. So right now it can be a little bit confusing between staff and between our design review board, what their responsibility is or what their role might be in the process. So we're trying to get really clear that the guidelines, which are the visions for what we would like to see and examples of how we would like projects to develop, those are really supposed to be under the purview of the design review board. They do make a recommendation to the planning director, but we really want to increase our reliance and the training and relying on their expertise in architecture and design to be able to inform the more subjective or recommendation piece of it. The standards are what live in the code, and those are what are really specific, as these should be required for every project. These are kind of the basics and the basic building blocks of what is important for the design as far as it interfaces with the public and with the public realm. The process and what's applicable, that has really been in some ways the meat of the project. We aren't really proposing any substantial changes, but a couple minor changes and changes to the application material and kind of moving the review process back to the beginning of the design process, we think is going to be really helpful for creating predictability. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. So I think now I'll hand it over to you, Grace, to talk a little bit about the steering committee and the timeline, and then diving into the guidelines a bit.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me. So the timeline, we started this project in 2020, actually just before the pandemic. So our initial meetings, some of our initial meetings, interviews, and tours happened in person, but we worked with a steering committee that was comprised of architects, developers, contractors that were working in the city of Bellingham on larger scale development. We had 3 meetings with them, I think 1 in person and 2 online. And then the other activities that we did in 2020 were reviewing all of the existing village documents. As Darby mentioned, there were a number of different versions here and there. And so we looked at them all to see what aligned and what didn't. And then really our task was to see if we could combine where we could, edit out, as she said, and then streamline the document into one. We also had discussions with Public Works and with our design review staff and folks that had been using the design review process to learn what was working and what wasn't. So with that, we then drafted the guidelines, and then as part of that work, we also did a number of interviews and tours. And so these are just some of the folks that we met with and talked with. We did go to all of the different neighborhoods and had conversations with folks in those neighborhoods. So it was a good and lengthy process. And then next slide. And in terms of the design guidelines themselves, this is intended to be a standalone document. When we first got to this project, we were like, oh, okay, there's a standalone document for this urban village here. And then there's some guidelines that were tucked into code in another urban village. And the intent is that that future applicants wouldn't have to hunt for which is applicable in which urban village, that there's just kind of one source. It applies to all urban villages. And these are a set of recommendations on how to apply the design principles. So really quickly, this table of contents is the quick snapshot. We have an introduction to it, a how to use the guidelines section, and that's kind of a sort of graphic depiction, a glossary so that there's common, the terms that are being used are like not being interpreted. It's like, this is how the city of Bellingham is interpreting them. And then the guidelines are divided into 3 categories. There's a site category, and that's really intended to deal with the site and how it interacts and interfaces with the overall urban village, as well as the natural systems are surrounding or within. And the public realm is really about the relationship of the building with the adjacent sidewalks, open spaces, and how they support how that experience can be supported, the public experience. The 3rd category is building design, and that addresses the overall architectural concept and the materiality. And within the document, each of these categories is represented by a letter. So S for site, P for public realm, B for building design. And then there are 3 or 4 different intents for each of the sections. And then there's 2 standalone appendices. One that is sort of urban village specific design character guidelines. Those are generally like 1 or 2, as Darby said, special snowflakes for those specific urban villages. And then the historic building guidelines, Fairhaven sort of got its own special snowflake of a whole appendix section because there were some very different characteristics there that needed to be addressed. Next slide. So we'll just kind of walk you through one of the intents to kind of show you how this is intended to be used. So I think the next slide has kind of the breakdown, Darby. Yeah. So the category is noted in the upper left with a big graphic S1 or S2. The intent is a very quick synopsis of what the guideline is supposed to, you know, the intention of it. And then that's followed with the introduction sort of right below it. Actually, yeah, right there. That kind of further helps to explain or expand upon the intent. And then the next slide has the guidelines. So each of these has anywhere from, I think, 4 or 5 to 7 guidelines. It's not the intention that each of the guidelines is supposed to be addressed. These are examples of how an applicant could satisfy the intent. So it's also possible for an applicant to come up with their own way of approaching that would be very site specific. And it's really how are they applying these guidelines to satisfy the intent that is outlined above. I think that, and then there's always a second page that provides some visual examples of what the intended outcome might look like. So there's a series of images that follow each of the intents. I think that's the synopsis. Oh, are you going to talk about the, okay, or is that
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just touch on this quickly. Thank you for that overview, Grace. I hope that as you were flipping through your packet, you saw something that was clear, easy to read, easy to use. That's what we're going for. This is an example of a page from the individual urban village appendix. So you'll notice when you get to the back of the document that Appendix A has a section for each of our 7 urban villages that kind of describes the character. We did some work to identify gateways, where pedestrian intersections happen, key intersections on a map, so that there's a reference point to maybe some special considerations that the design review board might want to take into account or the applicant might want to take into account. And then again, we pulled out things that were specific to those urban villages. So I think hopefully that's pretty intuitive as you work through the document. And now I'm going to turn it over to Katie to talk. I'm sorry, Emmy. I just spent quite a bit of time with her cousin. So Emmy is going to talk with us a little bit about the process for developing the historic commercial or the historic guidelines. Thanks, Emmy.
Yeah, thank you, Darby. So basically what we did is we combined what was the historic guidelines for Fairhaven and City Center and made it applicable for all of the urban villages. And again, these are guidelines, so they're not standards, and they're intended for buildings that are found to be historically significant or eligible for listing. That means 50 years or older federally, or for the state of Washington, 45 years or older and found to be eligible. So these are just general practices for those historic buildings, commercial buildings within the urban villages, and what you want to do for those buildings. And of course, any applicant can reach out to staff or the state to find if it is eligible, if it is historic. And basically, because not all urban villages had these guidelines, we wanted to combine and make it eligible for all urban villages. And I think this is included in your packet. So if anyone has any questions on that, I'm happy to answer. But this is just guidelines for those existing buildings and any also additions to those historic buildings. So.
And I just want to clarify one thing I said earlier. So these historic guidelines are for the existing buildings, and I misspoke by saying that the Appendix B was for Fairhaven. Fairhaven is actually part of Appendix A. There's just one or two.
Grace,
We lost you there for a minute, Grace. I think accidentally.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So the appendix is supposed to address, Appendix A is supposed to address the specific guidelines for Fairhaven that are for new buildings that are being built in that district. The historic guidelines are for existing older buildings that meet that historic designation. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you both. So that's kind of the end of our overview of the guidelines. I do have, not necessarily to get into discussion today, but here are some questions that we just want you to be thinking about as you're looking at the packet over the next couple of weeks. Whether we've covered the elements that are really important for good design. Is it clear? Is it easy to use? These are some of the things that we would love to get your feedback on as we move into the work session. I think, why don't we keep moving through? We only have a few more slides of the presentation, and then we can hold questions and topic areas for when we get through to the end. Okay, so next, the kind of that second category is the Urban Village Design Standards. And again, these are standards that live in the Bellingham Municipal Code. One of the pieces of the exercise that has been really detailed and is part of the reason why your packet is so huge is that we really wanted to relocate all the regulations into the development regulations section of each urban village code. So right now, again, they lived in different places. Sometimes they were mixed into the sub area plans, which is supposed to be more of a policy document. So what we've done is try to take all those unique standards and either unify them so they apply to all urban villages, and that would be in that 2025, like the main body of the design standards. And then the ones that are unique and should really just be kept separately, then those are in each individual urban village plan in the Bellingham Municipal Code 2037. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, we tried to get really clear about what the priorities are. So you'll notice there's two sections in the design standards. The first is related to site design, kind of similar to the guidelines. And the second is related to building design. And again, these are really specific for how the code says that it needs to be done. Parking lots need to be to the rear of the building. Refuse enclosures need to be screened. blank walls, here's the definition, here's how they need to be treated. There is an opportunity within those standards for an applicant to request a departure, and there's specific criteria in there. If there's some sort of hardship why it can't be met, and they can demonstrate that the intent of that standard is can be met in a different way, then that can be presented to the design review board and approved by the director. But broadly, they are supposed to be, pretty simple checklist of things to be met. Over here in the red, there are some pieces and some topic areas that were kind of meshed into the code that we have decided make more sense to be pulled into the guidelines. So you'll notice when you go through that the things that have been crossed out, there's pretty detailed notes as far as whether it has been moved elsewhere or whether we now think that the broad urban village guidelines are going to cover that topic area. So things like the orientation of the building, variation of building design, mass and bulk, materials, details, and relationship to public open spaces are really comprehensively addressed in the urban village guidelines. And we feel like having those intent statements that are clear and some different ways to achieve those problems are going to result in a better design, more creativity, and more clarity than being really, really specific about how all those things need to happen, which so the feedback that we received in the workshops is really wanting to avoid some of that cookie cutter design that you can sometimes see where, okay, once we know this works and we're just going to only build this building, we'd really like to open it up to allow more creativity through the design review process. So again, here's just some thoughts as you continue on your review about whether it is clear and the urban village standards that apply to all projects, if that makes sense. If there's any that are too narrow and seem too specific that we should really be lifting up a little bit higher and move them into the guideline level, or if any just don't seem to make sense, that would be really great feedback for us. Okay, and finally, last couple of slides here. We want to talk a little bit about the design review process. The blue circles here kind of describe the big milestones in the process as it exists today. There's a pre-application conference that it kind of varies right now as far as what level or what phase in the design process applicants are in. Sometimes people come in when they're just doing feasibility on a property and they just want to gather information. Other times we have applicants come in and they are at 50% design and they're ready to roll and they just want to get the details done. So that's been a little bit challenging. Even though the conferences are beneficial, sometimes the design is pretty far along by that point. And then today, the design review board then does their review. It's often very narrowly focused on any areas that the staff didn't agree on. So the design review board sometimes doesn't get the opportunity to really look at the big picture and the context of the site and how the elements interrelate. The neighborhood meeting then comes after, and some of the feedback that we've heard is that the public can sometimes feel like the project is pretty fully baked cake by the time it gets in front of them, not necessarily feeling like they have a meaningful role in the process, not maybe understanding how their feedback is incorporated. And I think it has resulted in some frustration on all sides. And then after the neighborhood meeting, the applicant moves on to the design review application or any other land use applications, and then to the design response meeting. Buildings that are listed on our local register have an entirely different process under Bellingham Municipal Code, and we're not touching that. So just a little note at the bottom there. So you'll see in the proposed process changes that we want to be really clear that this pre-application, we've been kind of toying with the way what to call it, but we've landed on pre-design conference. We really want that to be something more than just an over-the-counter or a call to the permit center. Hey, tell me what the zoning is. Tell me what I can do on the property. but a little bit less than our technical pre-app meetings. It's an opportunity for the applicant or the architect to come in and meet with the planners. We can pull in Public Works or Fire and really together talk about what the priorities are, if there's any yellow flags or site constraints or characteristics about the street or other elements, site considerations, architectural context that should be considered. Then we're proposing to move the neighborhood meeting to the next step and to really coach the applicant and or the architect to present to the neighborhood what some of the concepts are. What are the design inspirations? What's the material board? We've talked about like showing your Pinterest board to the neighborhood and saying, hey, here's the general mass and bulk. Here's what we're thinking about building. What can you tell us about this property? What can you tell us about this neighborhood? Or here's a couple different alternatives that we're exploring. What do you have a preference? And really using it as an opportunity to get some meaningful feedback and to introduce the project as it's in its early stage, like maybe at a 20% design. At that point, then we'd bring it to the design review board, but we'd really be asking for that mass and bulk level. This is also an opportunity for the applicant to say, here's the intent statements I think apply to this project. Staff would also be providing guidance on that early in the pre-design conference. And then the design review board has the opportunity to say, okay, yes, these are the ones that apply. Here's some specific things we would need you to consider. Go forth and design. So at that point, they would take that feedback from staff, from the design review board, from the neighborhood, and use that more comprehensively to go to the next level of a 40 to 60% design, and then come back with the actual elevations, the more detailed designs that sometimes get presented at the beginning of the process. And what we're hoping is by front loading that, that the finalization of the process is going to be very clear, very smooth, and they can continue on with the opportunity to even waive the design response meeting if staff and the director are in agreement that they have met the direction of the design review board in the early meeting. We've been working a lot with Public Works on conversations on how to better integrate the Public Works standards and review process into this. Sometimes it's felt, I think, to applicants that they are dealing with two different heads of the same body, and having to kind of negotiate between those two departments of, okay, there's something that's in conflict, or, you know, we were told to do this for design review, but then it conflicts with the Public Works requirement. So building in a lot more of the Public Works review early on, and carrying that through as the project details fill out to make sure the Public Works department has eyes on it, and that they're making commitments, and that they're signing off on the design review process is something that we feel will be a good improvement and create a better team and collaborative mentality and outcome. So yes, we would love your feedback on if you think that will be the case. Again, as far as schedule goes, I didn't put the date on here, but October 20th, which is in a couple weeks from tonight, we have the public hearing and work session scheduled. And then we have a couple projects in the works to use as pilot projects to start testing these guidelines and standards and start the training for the board and staff and applicants. It's possible we might get to city council by the end of the year, but it may also be first quarter, and we still have to iron that out a little bit. So that is it for our presentation tonight. And we'd love to hear any questions, feedback, or topics that you'd like us to prepare more information for the next meeting.
Okay.
Or if you want to just vote, no, just kidding. No, we're going to have the public hearing. We do want to hear what the public has to say too.
Yeah, so this is an opportunity for us to give staff questions and input and topics we'd like to tease out so that we can be informed at the public hearing and have a good, robust conversation in 2 weeks. So we don't have to go into line by line stuff tonight necessarily, but kind of broad strokes and like, what would you like to see in a future presentation to kind of help you really dive into the details? So whoever would like to kick us off? Jed?
Yeah, just in terms of the design review board waiving that final meeting for the design, I'm just wondering, would that information that would be adequate to show the city that the intent was met, would that be part of the land use application?
Yes.
Okay.
And we also talked about when the land use application comes in and that notification goes out to the community, that we could also make sure that the design review board sees it and sees it comes through. So if sees it come through. So if there were some concerns or issues that they would have the opportunity to bring it to the attention of the director.
Rose?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Grace Kim and the staff for working on this. I know this has been a big project that's been discussed for a really long time. So it's nice to see things coming forward to Planning Commission. And yeah, overall, I just feel like you guys nailed it in terms of streamlining and simplifying and cleaning it up and getting clarity on things. You know, like the intent of the code has always been the mystery. And so to have these guidelines is so nice. Was there guidelines like this before?
There were, but they were kind of mixed in and scrambled, and you had to kind of Where's Waldo it to figure out where they were. So in the city center design standards document, it was really historic heavy, but in that document, there was a little bit about new construction. So we kind of took that and said, okay, let's make this live here and this lives here. In the actual urban village design standards, the guidelines were kind of mushed in there, which we could kind of see and kind of went back and forth of, well, is that a good thing? Because then you have a guideline and then the standards immediately tied to it. So you can see the relationship between the two. But ultimately, we felt like it wasn't as clear as to what was really required and which was what was desired. So we tried to keep the categories the same. So it was really intuitive, but this way people know these are requirements, these are desirements.
Yeah, I love it. And what a good idea to do some pilot projects and test to see how things go before passing it or taking it to council. So really excited to see you guys putting it to action and seeing what happens. One question, just curious, how long does it typically take to schedule these meetings? You know, I know that one of the things that is like the complaints that we hear is that it's a slow process, but is like, it seems like it's more streamlined. I love having the neighborhoods have more meaningful input early on. That's just feels like the right thing to do. But just curious, like how long does it take to get in front of the design review board and get a pre-application meeting these days?
I lost my cursor on my triple screen. Sorry. I'll probably open this response up to Kathy, who's on the line. But one of the things that we have been doing as part of the process review is looking at ways that we can hold time on the calendar. So for those pre-design meetings, can we just have a couple standing times a week, blocks that are blocked out by the planners? So when those come in, we can just be like, boom. And if there's nothing, then we have free time on the calendar to work on permits. And just for context too, when I started on this project, I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be like, this is so overwhelming, all of our urban villages. But really, we have quite a bit of development happening in the urban villages, but it has been translating to about 7, 8 projects a year. So, you know, that waxes and wanes, but just to get a little better handle on, okay, we're not talking about 100 projects. We're talking about maybe a dozen, or normally less, half a dozen projects. So not just for the staff for the pre-design meeting, but also for the design review board, looking at, can we hold time multiple times a month so that we don't have to have the schedule pushed out so far. And then another piece that actually surprised me quite a bit as we started diving in is the idea of the application materials and what the expectations are for the applicant and for staff. Right now, the review is very, very staff heavy early on. The staff reports are very detailed. They're basically doing a very comprehensive zoning compliance review. With this idea of moving the review earlier in the design process, and having a really simple chart with all the intent statements, the applicant checks, boom, boom, boom. Here's the ones that apply. Here's how I addressed it. Staff looks at that chart. They say yes, no. If no, here's our question, or here's our concern. So trying to create some templates and some like systems that make it a lot easier for everyone involved, so we don't have to spend 2 weeks drafting a staff report and routing it to everyone in town. And like, how can we speed up things on that end? I don't know if Kathy, if there's anything else that you want to add to that, but that's been some of my observations as we've been working through this.
Good evening, Kathy Bell with the Planning Department. From a timing perspective, Rose, it's really so different, and it really depends on the level of the information that they present at the rezone. I mean, at the pre-application. And ironically enough, sometimes the more information they provide, the longer it takes, because they're already so far along that we haven't had the opportunity to go through with them and it's not just the design standards, it's how it relates to the zoning and how it relates to the comprehensive plan. So there's a lot more to it. So we believe that the most efficient way is the process that's being proposed, and that is to start out with very little and build as you go. So we all come along together, including the public, including the architects, and including staff. And that's really what this is designed to do. So we don't get something that is, in their opinion, building permit ready, and then submitting that to staff for comment. And then we're supposed to go to one of the design, whether it's the Historic Preservation Commission or the Design Review Board, commenting, and they're like, we're ready to go to building permit. You guys need to approve this. We're ready to go. And we're like, no, let's back up. And so a lot of that too has just been education on our part and making the board stronger and know what their role is, and that it is supposed to be pre-application, not design, build, ready, right? So we just specifically, to answer your question, for how long does it take for the design guidance, it always seems like every project's in a rush. And so typically I would say, and granted, we've already reviewed it through a neighborhood meeting. We've already reviewed it through a pre-application staff conference with the city. We maybe see it about 2 weeks to get an application, prepare our staff work to present it to the board. So once they get to a certain point, it moves pretty quickly. And we've really tried to narrow down what guidance we seek before the board, because as you can imagine, you saw all the standards and all the guidelines. When they are less clear, trying to ask the boards and commissions to do a lot of thorough review on things that sometimes aren't even that clear to us. So we have really tried to work within the process, and then this is very exciting because it'll just make that process much better for everybody.
One of the ways we talked about also sort of setting clear expectations and not getting people submitting full design packets was to provide some example packets that they could look at. So those would show kind of really simple massing blocks, not full design packets. So hopefully that will also set the expectation of how much work people should be doing before they get to the first meeting.
I had a quick question for you, I think, Darby, when you were talking about the design process. I think you said maybe about 20%, that first 20% then during the design review process, you would be going out to the neighborhoods and having neighborhood meetings. I don't know if you've anticipated this, but what if there's some, shall we say, disagreements or concerns that the neighborhood meetings are discerning to you? Is that enough time at 20% to change some things in the route, or to listen to their concerns and then make some revisions? Or are you too far along the process, or should you start earlier? I just want to throw those things out if I could.
That's a great question. And right now they're going to the neighborhood when they're at more of like a 60+% design. So I was seeing Grace nod. She is an architect. So I will, let her answer it, but that's our feeling, is that getting in front of the neighborhood earlier is a much more likely opportunity. And also that we would ask the applicant, when they submit their design guidance materials, to provide their summary. This is what we heard at the neighborhood meeting, and here's how we addressed it, and make them accountable for sharing that information and providing how they responded. And that goes on the record and the public can see, here's how my comments have been incorporated. Grace, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything else.
Sure, I can just say that the intent is to have the design early enough in the process. So 20% is massing, and maybe there's some preliminary floor plans, but it's early enough that that there should be lots of things that could change. It's drawings, lines on paper. It's not details and engineering and that sort of level. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've had a lot of interesting conversations with our development community and with our public works department of like, when does the big money start getting spent? And how can we have these conversations and get kind of the big picture sketched in before the big money starts happening? And it's a little tricky because a lot of times the big money is what answers the big questions, right? Like, where's your stormwater going to go? How much road design is possible, and how many parking spots are we going to be able to get, and where can we put all these things? But at least the more that we can do to set expectations up before that cash starts really flowing is going to be helpful. Mike, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike.
All right, let me get my hand down here. Just gonna play a little devil's advocate here for a second, so please don't judge me. If the project is ticking boxes and they're sticking to the rules, what does a neighborhood meeting do? Why have one? Other than the fact that
I mean, I think you know what, that's kind of the conclusion that we came to at the beginning of this project when we were talking to everyone involved. And it's like, what is the point of doing this? Are we just checking a box of, okay, we have to go to the neighborhood, and the neighbors are frustrated and they feel like, this is really hard to feel like I'm making any, like my input's being considered at all. We really think moving it to early in the process, again, at that 20% design, is going to be that opportunity for them to actually give feedback. We realize there's going to be some coaching and preparation involved for the applicant and the developer of like, okay, if you're debating different mass and bulk and orientation, you can show both, get feedback from the neighborhood on which one is more important. Maybe they have some historic information about the property of, oh, there used to be this something here that we really loved, or this is kind of the character of our neighborhood. And also just a chance to introduce the project when it's early and to say, you know, here we are, here's what we intend to build, here's what's allowed under the zoning. Here's our inspirations, our materials that we're thinking about. What do you think? Instead of showing, and we really weighed the pros and cons of this. I think there were some points where it's like, oh, is the neighborhood going to have enough to respond to? Versus showing up and having elevations and drawing, and this is what we intend to build. What do you think? Well, we've already invested tens of thousands of dollars in this drawing that we're showing you, so we're pretty attached to it. Versus showing up a little bit earlier and more collaborative conversational mode of here's where we're headed, here's what we're allowed to do, here's where what we're thinking about doing. We think that it will be a more meaningful process, but like really open to that conversation of what you, how you think it will be received.
And Mike, to your point, it's like if you know the project team has checked these are the intents that we're doing and they're following all the rules, then hopefully it's a pretty seamless meeting with the neighborhood. But the hope is that if they've checked the intents of what they're going to do and the neighborhood doesn't agree, then that's the chance to weigh in and provide some input before the design team goes way down the road and is invested, as Darby said, in the design that's on the table. That gives them chance to like move the massing around if they're occupying, you know, building the building all the way to the corner, and the neighborhood says that's a really important corner for these reasons, or you know the way that the massing works is going to shade the open space to the north of that. Those are opportunities that the neighborhood could, you know, bring these things to light, point to another intent or another guideline and say that this, while you've listed these four intents as being important, we think this other intent is more important or equally important. So that's the way that the neighborhood can share their voice.
Thank you, Darby and Grace. Quick follow-up question, who breaks the tie there?
Well, the design review board would make a recommendation, which is strongly considered by the planning director, who has the ultimate approval of the design review permit.
Thank you.
I think it'd be interesting to see on neighborhood meeting topic, like what kind of concerns do we typically see raised if you have a list of that type of stuff? You know, I think you can picture, you know, we talk about this with various types of building like ADU, or if you imagine you had a small infill project in a neighborhood and you had a neighborhood meeting, you'd have a certain kind of comments. But if we're talking about downtown or Sandwich Way or urban villages, the concept of neighborhood is a little bit different than what we think of as like, you know, Potter Street, you know, the neighborhood that you walked on the same street on. And so the neighborhood for a large urban village is a more varied business owners, residents, and you know, we think of neighborhood meetings as often having kind of the same three types of complaints. Well, this will have more traffic. This will have more this will have parking issues. I won't be able to park my cars easily. The shade, the building will be too tall. But really, design review isn't designed to address traffic, parking. The building will be 5 stories. Those are all built-in assumptions, you know, depending on the zoning. So what type of concerns do people bring to these neighborhood meetings that are sort of in that camp of, yeah, we hear you, but that's not really something we can wiggle on here. And then more on the like second camp of helpful comments that do influence actual changes that in the process.
So
I think most of the, I think most of the comments are those kind of big three right now, but part of the preparation for the neighborhood meeting will be to say, here's what the zoning, the box is. Here's the number of units, or here's the height, or whatever. These are the rules that we're allowed to build. And here are the elements that we're here to really talk about. What is it going to look like? What's it going to feel like? What's the interrelationship going to be between the street and the sidewalk and the building? The character of the neighborhood, and to really hone in on these are the elements that you do, that, you know, that we do really want to hear, and that we can really influence and play with. And then Grace. yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is a chance for the neighborhood, if the, local business, if there's a chamber or something in the area that says, let's try to encourage people to put flower boxes out or to, make space for cafes and things like that. Things that are not in the design and development guidelines. It's more just like as a business district or as a neighborhood commercial area, we want to see certain things happen. It's a chance for the neighborhood in that regard show up and say, just so you know, these are some things that the business owners in this area have been talking about. It's not a requirement. It's not anything but more than letting the applicant know, because it's not, those would be things that are not written anywhere, that are not required anywhere, but that would, if you're going to be a good neighbor, it'd be nice if you knew about these things and could, either modulate your storefronts or provide little recesses and entries, or think about where you could have hanging baskets, or, think about weather protection and things like that. Just things that would be more congruent with the neighborhood and with the folks around them. Because it might be that, like, and we said this, in some neighborhoods, there is an urban village, but there's really not a context there. Like, there's an aspiration of what's to come, but it might still be like old land use patterns of, strip malls with parking in front. So it hasn't flipped over. So it's a chance for folks to come with their aspirations for what the neighborhood might be, could be. It might be described in some sort of neighborhood plan somewhere, but it might also just be business owners talking amongst themselves.
Thank you. Scott, you've had your hand up.
Thanks, Mike. First of all, really good conversation about residents and how important it is to bring them along. I think being a good neighbor, like Grace said, it's really important. And I think there is a lot of complaining about the complaining in regards to the neighborhood associations coming in with lots of complaints that in the end don't really matter. But in the end, it may even save the city and the developer time and possibly money, because if you bring the neighborhood along, then there's less complaints and less negativity down the road. So I think it's a pretty important process, even if it doesn't make any legal changes like the tie, like Mike said. Making sure that the city knows what's happening before it happens will really help the positivity within the city. And I think residents together can then build the city in a better way. My question was, and maybe this was touched on, is this all seems to be a lot of pre-process. Are there any changes to the end buildings and the end developments based on what we're talking about here with this document? Are these buildings going to be different in any way because of these changes? Does that make sense?
Hopefully they will be better. That's the whole intent of this process, is to see greater design excellence.
I had the similar question as Scott, and I'll just expand on that. Like, someone comes in and they have a 5/1 5-story box with windows, and it's just got like plain siding, and like what nudges happen at that point where you say, actually, you need to modulate in and out, or make it more interesting? Like, what would it look like if you, like, I'm thinking if we could have like an exercise where we go through like the process timeline and have a hypothetical, like someone brings something, it doesn't meet the intents. What does it look like to evolve to something different? Because I think we see buildings built today, and it's hard to know unless you sat in all the meetings, probably within City Hall, not even on the design review. What did the applicant come with, and then what did it end up looking like? What got built? And so is it like the brick color changed? Okay, cool, we got that out of design review. Or is it actually like all those conversations about the architectural interestingness of the building, like where are we able to push and like iterate through and seeing how that changes from initial concept to finished product, like in the old system and in the new system?
And Mike, in regards to that, just to get back to my point, when Grace said about better, what specifically would be better? Because sometimes better is an opinion, and it's someone's better, but it's not everyone's better. Can we get back to that real quick?
Yeah, and I'll just say that there is no guarantee to good design. So in general, and I work in the city of Seattle, but I also work in lots of other places, and you all have driven other places, and there's good architecture and there's bad architecture, all within the same set of rules, guidelines, process. So the design guidelines and the design review process, it's the intention and hope to strive for better design excellence, for design excellence. That's the whole purpose of the design review program. It cannot guarantee that happens. So that's dependent on the design team that you hire, and also a little bit on the developers and what they're dictating to their design teams. So I think to that point, the hope is that the design guidelines give folks, the development team, a wide range of options instead of prescribing, you must do this, like you must have this roof angle and you must have this siding color or type, and you must have windows of this certain size. When you start to become that prescriptive, that also doesn't result in good design. So it's really a chance to have a dialogue to allow design teams to have some interpretation of how they are meeting these intents. And then it's really up to the design review board to say, yeah, that's kind of meeting the intent, but it's not, fully meeting it. If they get to the point of submitting their land use application and the staff is still like, they're not really getting it, they're going to have to come back to the design review board with a more complete design package. And that at that point, the design review board still has the ability to say, no, you're not getting it. Like, you're saying that you're trying to modulate, but 6 inch or 2 inches of facade change isn't modulation. There's some of those things that are going to be prescribed in development standards, but there'll be a genuine opportunity for that conversation of, yeah, you're not getting, like, if they are checking the boxes and they're doing it and they're getting it and the design is coming along in a way that's productive, then great, then they have the chance to pass or be exempt from that second review meeting. But I suspect that that's not going to happen for the first couple of years, that the whole development community is going to have to figure out, and it's going to be bumpy, and there'll be some projects that will have to come back.
Thanks, Grace.
Before I turn it over to Kathy to respond to, I just want to add to what Grace's thread was about what's different between what we're proposing now and what we're doing before, is I think it's much more clear, again, that hierarchy. Before, things were all kind of jumbled together, but now it's very specific. Here are the intent statements, and we boiled it down to a handful or maybe 2, 10 things. And then for the standards, it's very clear what the expectations are, and they're really related to the experience of the building and the public's interaction with it. And that public interface, the sidewalk connection, the experience of the pedestrian walking down the street, and kind of just the most important basics. So I feel like that has been greatly improved from before. But Kathy, I think you have something to add too.
Yeah, I was just wanting to comment that all of your questions are spot on, and they're things that we struggle with all the time. And design review is so challenging and it is so difficult, and it's so opinionated as to what people do and don't like. And there's a lot of development right now in the city where people go, oh my God, this is the worst building I've ever seen. And others go, I love it. And so what makes it better? I think that's going to be your own judgment of your own opinion as to the design of the building. What I ultimately think what we're trying to make better is by having better standards, better guidelines, just better code and better process, it will be better. And it's all so integrated that we're not going to get all brick buildings. We're not going to get any style of building. I can tell you, at least right now, one of the unfortunate consequences of what we see is if a building works in one place, then they basically submit the same thing with maybe a little bit of different siding somewhere else. So if you're driving around town and you have deja vu, it's probably because you're looking at almost the exact same building that is somewhere else. Because if they've got it approved once, it's pretty hard to deny it again, unless there's a really strong neighborhood context. So Scott, you ask really good questions and they're really difficult to answer, and some of them are so theoretical, but we're hoping that by starting with just a better set of rules where they're easier for everybody to understand, including the public. Neighborhood meetings for design review are really challenging, and your comments are right. They don't want traffic, they don't want the development because it's too big. They don't, there's going to be stormwater issues, there's never enough parking. And we hear, and that's pretty much every development in the city of Bellingham, but we do hear that from design review. Often it's never about design because our standards, our guidelines are so difficult to articulate, where these are much more tangible. And that's what we're really hoping is what is going to make this better. In part, that is what's going to make it better. And also having informed commissions and boards that have the same level of understanding so that they can actually add value to the process. So that, I hope, helps at least offer a different perspective of what's going to make it better.
Jed?
Yeah, I did see going through the packet, the building steps along the sidewalk that got pulled, which I think was one of those, everybody asked for that departure, so it made a lot of sense to just get rid of that one. Are there any other areas that were kind of similar to that were just like almost always you're getting departures from this one, and it's kind of just a stamp, it's going to happen because it's so often asked for? That I have another follow-up question as well, which is kind of in line with that.
That's a great question. And we did really try to err on the side of, not hacking everything out because we thought we had some good stuff to start with. But the other one that comes to mind is there was a standard about separation of ground floor residential uses. And it was very specific that the elevation of the residential unit had to be raised, like, I can't remember the exact number, but like 36 inches above the sidewalk.
Yeah, I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah, and people were really running into issues with compliance with ADA, where you end up with a ramp being at the front of the building. There's also situations where the market might not support ground floor commercial uses now, and residential is more appropriate, but in the future, as the district develops, it could be very appropriate for a commercial storefront. So how do we allow more flexibility in conversion over time, whether it's a subfloor inside the building that's raised, or a way of creating privacy with patios and landscaping, even though it's at grade. So we moved that away from a standard and just talked in the guidelines about privacy and clear delineation between private and public uses, and leaving that more open. But that's the other one that really comes to mind besides the step back.
Okay. But you did end up keeping the 20-foot commercial on like streets. Is that, I'm pretty sure I saw that one still in there.
You mean the required ground floor commercial?
Yeah,
we did, although we are proposing scaling that back in the waterfront district. Right now, ground floor commercial is required for the entire stretch of Granary and Laurel. So most of you know that's the street that's there. That would be commercial, that whole stretch. And the feedback that we've received from both our retail consultants and talking to other planners and to our consultants is that's not necessarily desirable to turn the waterfront, that whole stretch, into like a strip retail type district. But again, to allow conversion over time, and there could be locations on that stretch that are really appropriate for ground floor residential with the opportunity to convert. So we are proposing to make that more flexible instead of having it required the whole stretch.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The steps is difficult for the ADA. In some cases, it limits what you can do with project types and certain numbers of apartment units getting to the threshold of ADA for apartments. Other question I had is just kind of like on, downtown and urban village and, more of the historic kind of standards, we're always looking at like having recesses at building entries and things like that. Kind of the current trend with homelessness, there's some problematic things that occur with certain design elements. So I wasn't sure if that gets addressed anywhere in the zoning code, or is that something that we just kind of look at the time and maybe have a conversation about it as a board or as a city, just as it's going, but we don't actually write anything into the guidelines.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. I think Grace might have some feedback on this as well, but my initial response is that it is so contextual. And there was some language in the city center design guidelines that's more related to a historic district, where Fairhaven might be a little bit different. But we don't have a specific standard that says it has to be a recess entry. And I do think it's something that would depend on the architecture of the building. What's the context of the rest of the streetscape? How does it fit in to those patterns? But yeah, you bring up a good point. Some of these things are like, we have to weigh all the different elements. But,
well,
yeah.
I mean, I see we're also promoting seating near entrances a lot, but yet we're not really defining what kind of seating, you know, but with like benches versus single chairs, you know, so you get into a lot of issues like that, where there might be things that, you know, currently I don't know, I guess I don't really honestly know what, you know, what the overall intent is with urban planning for, you know, addressing these kinds of issues, but it's a much deeper issue. So I'll let y'all continue.
There are some, so I think the intent is for it to not be all the same. So not to prescribe that, you know, you have to have benches or you have to have a certain type of seating. I do think there were some cities like street standards that were done by another team. And I'm blanking on the name of that, but I think in terms of your question about the recessed entries and things like that, we weren't specific about that. I think in the historic areas, it makes more sense to try to emulate some of that pattern. I think you know, who is sleeping there and how it's being used, I think that just is a city issue to be addressed holistically, not that you can't address that with just the architecture. I think to address it with just the architecture by saying everything must be flat all the way across the front, so there's no place for anybody to rest or pause. I think that results in an architectural character that you probably don't want to dictate.
I had a question about the interaction with public works, which was a big topic in some of the sessions I sat on back in 2020. And I watched a design review board meeting back at that time. It's for a building that's actually under construction on 4th Street now. And they came to the meeting with you know, designs for, you know, what the design review board would look at for all the different elevations. And they were kind of uncertain about where their parking entrance was going to be, and kind of like almost had like a begging attitude about like how to resolve the issue. And so Public Works said you couldn't put the garage entrance on the arterial, but the side street had a very strong slope, and then the alley was a floor above. So I think maybe the Public Works guidelines said you had to come in from the alley would be preferred, but that would mean the parking garage was on the 2nd floor. And so they had all these like landscape that, you know, the site didn't lead to complying with what Public Works wants. And I think it looks like the garage entrance is now coming on the arterial. So that negotiation must have somehow been resolved. But I'm curious if, as we look at the process deeper, where Public Works plugs in more explicitly on, you know, issues of both, you know, driveway interface, sidewalk issues. And there was someone mentioned something about just like utilities and pipes, and like if you want to come into the right of way, that's like allowed by design, but then Public Works is like, no, there's a pipe there, you can't. So like, how can people be creative with boxing in or out onto the sidewalk as desired by design with you know, the limitations of the underground world?
I am so glad you brought up that example, because that is a perfect example to illustrate why that pre-design meeting is so important. So the planners would lead the pre-design meeting with the applicant, but in a situation like that where we're looking at, okay, there's a slope, there's an arterial, it's a corner lot. There's utility lines coming through here. Okay, we need to bring public works in at the very beginning and start to set up that box of expectations. Because that should be really early feedback. That's nothing that's a surprise. They know it's an arterial. We know that access is desired off the alley. So doing some problem solving and some conversation about that at the very beginning, I think hopefully they would have been able to avoid that situation where they have those drawings at the end and the elevations and they've already invested so much and then are trying to figure that out at that point. But yeah, that's a perfect example, or it could be a fire issue. And again, yeah, like what are the possibilities? We actually have been working with Public Works quite a bit, and they have agreed to allow for public improvements in the right of way in the urban villages, which has been a big stretch. Now, granted, like you mentioned, there could be certain situations that it's like, okay, it's not going to work here. It's a structural sidewalk or something like that. But those are also things that can be identified at the beginning. They're site considerations. They're not, they're things that can be flagged early on in the process.
Other questions? Well, if that covers most of the commission's concerns, any other closing thoughts from staff to prep us for 2 weeks from now?
Yeah, I guess I would, some of that, I didn't take extensive notes because it was such an engaging conversation. Thank you for your good questions and comments. I did write down a couple things about maybe a little bit more discussion about what a neighborhood meeting would look like. We could bring that. Potentially, I'll see what we can pull up, but something that illustrates a little bit about those different stages. Maybe some visual examples of what 20% looks like, what 40%, what 60%, and kind of what those expectations are for the different phases when we're talking about the process might be useful. I will ask our staff a little bit more about what the neighborhood meeting discussions tend to look like, and how we might start to shift the expectation of what the conversation would be like under the new process. And then I'll also do a little bit more review on what the departures, like some of those typical departures, and if there was anything else besides the step backs and the elevation that we ended up changing to guidelines. Those are some things that we can touch on at the next meeting. And Mike, maybe I'll circle up with you before the 20th too, to see if you think we should do the presentation again before the public hearing, or wait and see how many people are there. I don't want to have to repeat it for you, or if we want to do a condensed version, just kind of how to make sure anyone who shows up has the same context.
Do you all have a sense of the public's interest in this topic? Did this go on Engage Bellingham or do any other community feedback? I get the sense it's a little wonkier than other things that generate public interest, but I want to be receptive to anything that comes up.
Wonky is a good word. We're getting pretty nerdy here on the details, and we did talk a little bit about how far out to go with the community engagement, but because this is substantially a reorg, there are not a lot of substantive changes, I guess I would say. It's really looking at the organization, the streamlining, the procedures. If there were major content changes, like we're not going to do historic review in Fairhaven anymore, or we're going to get rid of all the design standards and just let if it was something like that, then we would certainly do a much more robust community engagement strategy. But we hope that it's pretty clear and that the materials are pretty clear with all the notes and everything, that we really tried to keep everything And to be really clear, if we did get rid of something, there was some rationale and some precedent behind that. So yeah, I don't know who who might be involved. We have been keeping the steering committee members. Mike, I know you were on the steering committee, and it's been a little sporadic as this project has been drawn out and usurped by other priorities over the last couple of years. But hopefully they also, you know, would be sharing the word to other people in the community who might be interested.
Yeah, since we're asking the public to come, I think it'd be nice to have a maybe condensed version of the presentation just to set the tone for people who are interested and want to speak. If some of the stakeholders come, I think they're probably well versed in what we're talking about, having been through that. But cool. Anything else?
I was just going to speak a little bit to future meetings, if that's okay.
Yeah, we can close the design review stuff and do other scheduling business. Go ahead.
Just to remind everyone, I'm sure most of you have heard that the mayor has rescinded the emergency COVID measures. And so, as you guys have probably all noted, council's meeting in person in October, and boards and commissions will return to the in-person format beginning in November. So that means that this body would be in council chambers beginning potentially November 3rd. That depends on what the work session on this topic, how that finishes on after the public hearing and the work session. If there's need for continued discussion, then that would happen on November 3rd. If not, we would skip that meeting, and it would be the Chuckanut rezone would be before you on November 17th. But regardless, both of those meetings would be in person. So that's exciting news, being back in person in chambers, and haven't had planning commission there for a long time. So I just wanted that you all to be thinking about that in your heads. And if you have questions, reach out to staff. Heather or I can answer your questions. We may have more information forthcoming from the administration on how details of that, but you can anticipate kind of like what you've seen. If you've seen any of the thing this past week, there's a hybrid option for the public where we have there's the regular media podium and screens up there in chambers, and then also a large flat screen TV for people that need to call in and participate in that fashion. So for the public hearing format, that would be an option, not for the public hearing on this topic, but for future public hearings. And yeah, so I just encourage you to be thinking about that, and we're excited to have that happening. So I think that was everything I had on that.
So just to reiterate for folks listening, for the foreseeable future, even though the commission will be in public, citizens can call in via Zoom to testify, as they have been doing these past 2 years.
Yes, they will be able to participate again in November, in person, sitting in chambers, giving public testimony at the media podium there, as we used to do before 2020, and then also have that Zoom in or call in option as well.
Okay. Thanks for the info.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we can adjourn, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.